All right, so good evening and welcome to tonight's segment of the faculty lecture series. For those of you who may not know who I am, I'm Jessica Lardy. I'm professor and director here, and I run the faculty lecture series. So we're starting something new this semester, moving forward and having a new faculty spotlight. And so Dr. Lee is the inaugural person for that space. So thanks for attending tonight's lecture. Keep an eye out for upcoming lectures. I have printed schedules over there at the table. Rack cards have been ordered. They're just not here yet. So otherwise, my email's out to campus as well to know what's coming up. Our next lecture will be Thursday, October 16th, featuring Dr. Jessica Brown from English. So this evening's event is presented by Dr. David Lee of History from the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. David Johnson Lee is an assistant professor of history in the HAPS department. His first book, The Ends of Modernization, Nicaragua and the United States in the Cold War, was published by Cornell University Press in 2021. He is currently working on several projects related to literature, politics, and indigenous identity in Guatemala in the 20th and 21st centuries, including translations of work by literary figures such as Miguel Angel Asturias and Humerto Ak'abal, and a book on the 2023 Indigenous Uprising in Defense of Guatemala's Democracy. Tonight's lecture is titled Ubix, ulew, Translating Maya Poetry Across History and Language. And in his words, this lecture will discuss the relationship between literature and history by examining the life and work of Quiche Maya poet Humerto Ak'abal, using poems translated into English from Quiche. This lecture will discuss the importance of linguistic difference, history, and philosophy for understanding Ak'abal's work. We will consider the importance of language and literature for understanding indigenous identity, history, and politics in Guatemala and across the Americas. So help me in welcoming Dr. Lee.
Beautiful. Thanks very much, Jess, and thank you all very much for coming. So I'll just go ahead and jump right in. So this is fairly new research for me, so I'm kind of presenting this for the first time. This is based on an article that I'm working on in a translation studies journal. So the title of the talk is ubix, ulew. It means the song of the earth in Quiche, and I'll explain what that means later on as we go through the talk. So we give very quick, we're going to cover a lot of material, so I want to give you a kind of overview of where we're going here. So we're going to start with an overview of history of Maya culture and history, culture, and language, especially as relates to recent Guatemalan history. Then we're going to talk about one of my favorite books, The Popol Vuh. Shout out to my kids from HGP 110. We're going to read this later in the semester. Then we're going to talk about the life of Humerto Ak'abal, main subject of my talk. And then finally, we're going to look at some of his poems and the process of translating them both between Quiche and Spanish and into English as well. So let's begin. An overview of Maya history and culture. I'm a historian by training, so it hurts my soul a little bit to give you about 2,000 years history in about 2 minutes, but sometimes that's what you got to do. So for starters, we're going to talk about Maya culture broadly, but there's no singular Maya culture. In fact, in contemporary Guatemala, there are, depending on how you count, at least 21 different dialects of Maya languages spoken. Quiche is the language we'll be discussing most today. This is the largest language with over 1 million speakers, but other major languages are Kaqchikel, Quechua, Mam, and Tz'utujil, 16 others. So we've got a timeline down here of classical indigenous civilizations. What's known as the classic period of Maya civilization actually ends well before the Spanish conquest. And so when you, for instance, if you travel to the Yucatan and you see these massive temple structures like at Palenque or Tikal or Chichen Itza, these, by the time of the Spanish conquest, had mostly been evacuated. And there's still a lot of historical debate about why this actually happened, but this doesn't mean that when this classical civilization ends, that Maya culture ends. Instead, Maya begin to disperse across this territory and begin moving into other areas of, well, from the Yucatan all the way down to contemporary Honduras. So 1524, the Spanish colonial period begins. You probably know the Spanish conquest of Mexico takes place in 1521. Hernán Cortés is going to send one of his deputies down to Guatemala, a conquistador by the name of Pedro de Alvarado, or Toñatú as the indigenous called him. And another important thing to know about the Maya, especially in distinction from the Aztec, for instance, the Aztec had a single unified empire ruled by an emperor. The Maya, each of these different languages belong to essentially a distinct city-state. So the Spanish come in and they conquered the kingdom of Quiche, which was the most powerful of these kingdoms, but that didn't mean that they had conquered all of these Maya cultures. And so what happens in the aftermath of the conquest is that many of these groups are going to move into the mountains, move into the highlands. And so technically this is going to become part of the Spanish Empire, but practically speaking, many of these indigenous cultures are going to remain independent, allowing them to maintain their languages, their cultures, their traditions. And so for several hundred years, the Spanish are going to rule this territory basically as a de facto ruler, but not actually controlling the indigenous populations. This is going to begin to change with the independence of Guatemala in 1821, same time most of the rest of the Spanish colonies in the mainland get independence, and non-indigenous elites, especially at the end of the 19th century, are going to begin coveting this land that the indigenous people who have moved into the highlands are still using to maintain their relative autonomy, maintain some independent crop production. The main reason for doing this is because a new cash crop has come to be very, very important: coffee, right? Coffee, as you probably know, grows best in high, shady regions. So this mountainous territory of western Guatemala is ideal. And so these followers of this liberal ideology, as it's called, under President Justo Rufino Barrios, are going to begin moving into the highlands, taking the territory from these Maya and turning them from independent proprietors who collectively own their territory into essentially plantation workers. And so this is going to further impoverish the population, further threaten the autonomy of these cultures. So now moving into the 20th century, so basically between the independence of Guatemala and 1944, there's a series of relatively authoritarian governments, even dictators. Jorge Ubico is the dictator in the 1930s. These dictators essentially invite foreign investment and continue this process of trying to take away autonomy and territory from the indigenous populations. Then in 1944, the people of Guatemala are going to rise up in not a full-scale revolution in the style of Cuba in 1959, but a pretty large-scale reform movement that's going to try and do away with many of these injustices. One of the biggest ones is that for several decades now, much of Guatemalan territory is going to have been controlled by an American fruit company. The United Fruit Company is called. They make money off of bananas, selling bananas in the United States, and they also own much of Guatemala's useful territory, as well as the railroad, the electric company. So one of the first orders of business in 1952, when Jacobo Arbenz is elected, is going to be a land reform, first and foremost trying to take this land back from these corporations and from these large landowners, and especially to redistribute it to the indigenous population. Doesn't go well if you know any history of the Cold War. Doesn't quite work out the way that everybody would like. And so in 1954, the CIA, goaded on, of course, by this United Fruit Company, but also based on the Cold War logic that nationalizing territory, taking away money from American corporations, is communism, and therefore justifying the overthrow of the government, protecting U.S. interests in the name of anti-communism. And so this is going to set off in 1960 a civil war, right? The Civil War lasts from roughly 1960 all the way to 1996 and leads not only to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans, but especially their efforts at total destruction of indigenous populations and genocide. So, with that kind of backstory, now I want to begin talking a little bit about my own encounter with this culture. So, my first book was about Nicaragua, as just mentioned, and then a couple of years back, basically right after the pandemic, I started traveling to Guatemala and studying the culture, and I encountered this book called the Popol Vuh. Popol Vuh, which I'll talk a bit more about, is considered the sacred book of the Maya, written shortly after the Spanish conquest, and it's written in the Quiche language. And so, as part of my effort to understand Guatemalan culture better, I went to a town called Quetzaltenango, which is in the highlands of Guatemala, northwest Guatemala. Decided I would take a lesson in Quiche, thinking that, oh yeah, okay, I'll spend an afternoon, learn how to say, hi, how are you, thank you very much, and then go about my business. Turned out this guy, Pablo Francisco Hernandez, is a really good teacher and a really amazing guy, and we started collaborating, and so I've been now his student for 3 years or so trying to learn the Quiche language, and our first work together was him teaching me how to read the Popol Vuh in the original language. And so talk in a moment so that's the kind of backstory for how I began translating Maya poetry. Oh, what the fuck? That's not where that's supposed to be. I screwed that up. Oh, well, that's Pablo's voice reading one of the poems we're going to talk about. Not yet. No. Okay, we'll go ahead and listen to it now. So that's Pablo reading Quiche, reading one of the poems we're going to talk about in a bit. And one of the reasons for including this, of course, I want to include my teacher and friend, but also to give you a sense of the sound of the Quiche language. And so we'll return to the importance, especially of this sonic quality and oral quality when we talk about the poetry of Humerto Ak'abal. So before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more about this text, the Popol Vuh, right? So as I mentioned, this is the sacred book of the Quiche Maya, and it's a version, the version that we have is clearly a version that has been written down of a much older text that had been passed down for generation to generation. But if you read the actual version of the Popol Vuh that we have, it's explicitly couched as a kind of response to Christianity. And so, right, in the immediate aftermath of this conquest by the Spanish Empire, one of their first efforts is going to be to evangelize the population, and they essentially treat Quiche religion as a form of devil worship. And this is used as an excuse to suppress the religion, kill anyone who tries to continue practicing it, and force everyone to convert to Christianity. And so very explicitly, this book is a direct response, even though, right, the authors are well aware that should it be found that they are continuing to worship this religion and that they are preserving it in this way, it's a direct threat to their lives. Nonetheless, they still feel it incumbent upon them to preserve it in this way, knowing that otherwise this culture is in danger of literally being wiped out. So now the book itself, the book is a creation story first and foremost, right? It tells the story of the creators of the universe, Cucumatz, sovereign plumed serpent, and Huracan, heart of sky. Cucumatz, if you know anything about Aztec mythology, this is roughly a similar deity to Quetzalcoatl, who's one of the chief deities of the Aztecs. And then heart of sky, another lord of the heavens. Notice his name, Huracan. This is where we get the term hurricane from, right? And so the relationship between weather, storms, and spirituality, something that we'll return to when we talk more about this poetry. So the basis of the story is that these creator gods get together, decide that, well, they've created this wonderful universe, but there's no one in it to appreciate it properly. And so they're going to set about trying to create creatures that they feel will be sufficiently awed by the wonders of nature and the beauties of creation that they will then worship these gods who have created them. And so the book starts by detailing the creation of humanity. The first round is kind of a failed attempt. They do manage to create living creatures, but these are essentially animals, right? These are animals that instead of worshiping the gods, they just make squawks and growls and things like that. And so not sufficiently articulate to do what they need to do. Next, they create men of mud. So these are these are in the shape of men, but they're not stable enough, right? Eventually, as soon as it rains, they're gonna dissolve in the mud. Next stage men of wood, a step in the right direction. These are more stable creatures, but, well, they're made out of wood. They're two-dimensional. They don't have anything on the inside, and therefore they're still not going to be able to sufficiently appreciate the beauties of the creation. And so finally, the creation comes to a point when the men of maize are created. That is, the men of corn, maize being the primary staple crop of this Maya civilization. My students from HGP 110 would know, too, that this is the moment when sedentary culture and sedentary civilization is really going to be possible. And so maize becomes the most important crop, but also central to Maya traditions and culture all the way up until the present. So from there, the story is going to diverge into pretty interesting and having a story which has quite a lot of resonance with the Christian story of the crucifixion of Jesus. So these two hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, think of these as demigods. These demigods are going to intervene in this process of creation because, well, the words of Xibalba. Xibalba would be the underworld, the equivalent of the Christian hell. The words of Xibalba are jealous of these creatures that inhabit the top of the earth, and so it's going to be necessary for Hunahpu and Xbalanque to travel into the underworld, defeat the lords of death at this Maya ball game. You can see here a depiction of this ball game, and then they eventually are going to get turned into the sun and the moon and also the gods of corn. So all this is to give you some background now about the richness of Maya culture, and leads me to my next slide in the subject of this lecture, Humerto Ak'abal. So Quiche Maya are rightly extremely proud of this Popol Vuh and proud of this literary tradition that was very nearly wiped out by the Spanish conquest, and even into the 20th century, right? Guatemalan education systems did not teach Quiche languages in schools. There was no attempt on the part of authorities to actually preserve this rich cultural heritage. And so this is where Humerto Ak'abal is going to come in. So in my studies of Quiche with Pablo, after reading the Popol Vuh together, we started reading the poetry of Humerto Ak'abal, who, as I'll talk about in a moment, writes simultaneously in Quiche and Spanish. And so for someone like myself, this is an amazing resource to be able to read his work self-translated in both of these languages at the same time. So Humerto Ak'abal was born Momostenango. This is a town about an hour north of Quetzaltenango in the highlands, the department of Totonicapán, 1952. This year should be familiar to you now, right? This is the year that Ak'abal Benz is going to be elected, bring into place the land reform, then get overthrown, leading to this Guatemalan civil war. So much of Ak'abal's adult life is going to be spent as, right, a person of Maya descent in this genocidal civil war, fighting to survive both the difficulties of poverty, but also the difficulties of actual threats of violence by the government. So his family, his parents were what are called Acohomab. Cohom is an indigenous form of marimba. So these would be traveling musicians who traveled to festivals and traveled around performing in local traditional celebrations. And also his grandparents are what are called Chuchkahau or Akkamalbe. So these are traditional ceremonial figures, religious authorities in this local indigenous culture. And so both his parents and his grandparents are going to instill in Ak'abal a belief in the necessity of preserving this culture. And so that, I argue, is going to be one of the main goals of this poetry and this poetic practice and this poetic art that we'll talk about in just a moment. So he grows up in very, very poor circumstances, right, in the mountains around Momostenango. So he has a couple of years of primary school, but he's primarily self-educated in literature, learns to read a little bit in Spanish, teaches himself how to read and write in the Quiche language, and works for a period as a garbage collector, which allows him to fish books out of the garbage and begin to educate himself in world literature. So in this book, his Testimonio de un Indio Quiche, he describes finding books like Dostoevsky or Samuel Beckett or Friedrich Nietzsche, and at first being totally baffled, as you can imagine, by the contents of them, but eventually figuring out and creating his own philosophy and understanding of the world out of this process of self-creation. So when he gets a little older, he's going to begin traveling to Guatemala City, first with his father. His father is an alcoholic, but they travel to Guatemala City to sell textiles that are being produced in Momostenango. His memoir also deals with the difficulties of having to basically manage both his family and his father at the same time. His father is eventually going to pass away while he's still a young man. And as the oldest male member of the family, he's going to become the breadwinner, which means that by the time he's a teenager, he has to travel and reside in Guatemala City, working in textile factories. And so they're basically sweatshops where mostly indigenous people would, for very low wages, be producing textiles for export economy. While he's doing all this, he's also beginning his work of becoming a poet in both Quiche and Spanish languages. And so through this process of self-teaching and self-creation, he creates some very important books of poetry. His first work is called El Animalero. Originally, he goes to publishers in Guatemala City and tries to get his Quiche language poetry published, but their reaction was, as you might imagine, well, first, nobody else besides the Quiche speaks Quiche, and also the levels of illiteracy in the Quiche culture are very high, and so nobody's going to buy these books. And so he's forced to publish his first works in Spanish only. However, this book, Animalero, becomes, the Animal Tamer is the translation, becomes popular enough in the wider culture that the publishers begin allowing him to publish his books simultaneously in Spanish and Quiche. And so this is the phenomenon we're going to look at, because this is a pretty interesting practice that it's going to illustrate the practice of a poet simultaneously writing his poetry in two languages at once. You might consider these translations of the poems, but also I think it's valid to think of them as more like simultaneous creations that are similar in a lot of ways, but also distinct in ways that we'll talk more about in a second. So, well, in the early 1990s, after his first books, he begins to gain recognition for his poetry, first winning the Quetzal de Oro in Guatemala, and then receiving lots more international attention. Prizes in Switzerland, the UN, Italy, France, the United States, and also having his work published in many of these European languages. Very important also, the vast majority of these people translating his poetry are going to be translating it primarily from the Spanish, again, because there are very few actual Quiche speakers, and so the logical thing to do for a translator would be to read the more common, well-known language. One more thing to add. So this information that I'm taking from his life, this testimonial that he produced, this testimonial was originally given in the early 1990s. Remember, still in the midst of this civil war. And because of the threat to his life, the threat that even describing the conditions of indigenous people in a realistic way could lead to jail or assassination, he has to publish it anonymously, and so it's published only in French, actually. It's only in the last 5 years that this book finally came out in Spanish with his actual autobiographical details returned to their proper place. So now we talk about, the poetry we're going to analyze in just a minute when we explain why I think this is particularly important, not just a kind of exercise in wordplay. So, first of all, right, I've already mentioned, Ak'abal is engaging in a process called auto-translation. This is actually fairly common among indigenous poets in the Americas because, right, the audiences for their poetry in their own indigenous languages would have been very small. And so, logically, if you want to reach a wider audience or even a global audience, then producing your work both in your own language and in a European language, much more likely to get you a much wider audience. But as we'll see, this is going to raise some interesting questions because, well, Ak'abal in particular firmly believes that there are very definite differences, distinctions between the Quiche language and the Spanish language that, well, in some ways don't translate very well. And so this raises some sticky issues for the relationship between these different poems. And so based on his theory of language, Ak'abal believes that, well, Quiche language in particular but Maya languages and other indigenous languages possess a peculiar capacity for expression. That is, they are able to express things that European languages simply cannot, or would have much more difficulty doing. And so this is due to the fact that they have a very large prevalence of what are called idiophones. Idiophone is a kind of word or expression that directly expresses the thing that it is describing. So the most common form of this, of course, in English is onomatopoeia. We're all familiar with the sounds of animals, woof woof or meow, to directly mimic the sound of the animal we're describing. Idiophones go much broader than this, though, because idiophones can actually describe some pretty abstract concepts. And we'll look at some examples in a moment when we look at the Quiche language. And so very importantly for Ak'abal, Quiche possesses this capacity for expression that other languages simply do not. Now, so what does this mean theoretically? So this is, in some ways, a challenge to one of the most important linguists of the 20th century, a French linguist by the name of Fernand de Saussure. His theory in his course of general linguistics, his theory is that, well, to analyze language, all you need to do is break it into the signifier and the signified. So the signifier is the sound we use to describe an object. So the word tree, for instance, that describes the leafy green thing outside, he believes that that signifier is inherently arbitrary. That is, there's no necessary relationship between the word tree, the sound that I say in English, tree in English, árbol in Spanish, che in Quiche, right? There's no necessary relationship between those things. And in fact, right, if you mistake those things, then you will not be able to analyze language properly. So Ak'abal, in his theory of language and in his practice, is going to be suggesting that, well, in fact, these signifiers that he's building his poetry around aren't arbitrary at all. In fact, right, they are direct expressions of the perception of the natural world. He also believes that the natural world speaks in a sort of language, and that language is actually being directly rendered in the Quiche versions of these poems that we'll be reading. So this, again, is going to raise some really interesting and tricky questions about translation, right? Well, how is it even possible to translate this direct communication of the natural world into a language which does not possess these same powers of expression? And so now, well, so this is of, hopefully you can see the linguistic importance, but also this is of a certain political importance, right? In the context in which Maya people are being persecuted for their language, their traditions are being destroyed, not only by the violence of the Guatemalan government, but also by the lack of proper teaching in schools, the lack of literature, and the general erosion of their culture. Well, Ak'abal, like many other members of minority groups, is practicing what you could call strategic essentialism. That is, he is claiming for Maya identity a certain kind of essential characteristic. So this is a suggestion that all of the characteristics that the Spanish conquest has been trying to stamp out of the Quiche people are in fact valuable and worthy of preservation, but also perhaps even sources of superior wisdom and knowledge even to the Europeans themselves. So especially this ability, this understanding of the natural world, and this ability to express it. And so there is, although very importantly, I don't think it's right to think of Ak'abal as a political poet per se, there is a kind of social project that is embedded in this poetry itself. How am I doing on time? We're good. Well, so my apologies. I put the clip of Pablo reading the poem on the wrong slide. This is the poem he's supposed to be reading. There's a little bit of chaos at the beginning of the lecture here. So, title of this poem in Quiche is Riwanab. Spanish, mi hermana. In both languages, it essentially means my sister. Hatchawiawe petinakriawa nab. Kinchikanik kinpakik. Chowiri huyub arekut kuil ikim shukuhe aksik. So what this poem is describing is, so the sister involved is a star, right? So the star is a star that, according to Maya, the Maya also have a very sophisticated system of astronomy and measurement of time. according to the Maya calendar, when this star appears, then this is the indication that the rainy season is beginning, and now it's time to go and plant the corn. So the story here is, right, so the grandmother of the narrator is telling them to go run see if their sister has come. Now notice also this is claiming a kind of familial relationship with the natural world. We'll see this too as a very important aspect of this Maya worldview that at times can be difficult to translate. So right, the poem continues. I run skipping to the top of the hill so I can see down south. She hasn't come. It's getting chilly. We can smell the earth's breath. The wind dances. The grandmother says, run once more to see if your sister has come. And then we get to the second to last stanza here. She's come, Grandma, she's come. Petinach, nuatit, petinach. So now let's look very closely at the language here. So the Quiche version, petinach, nuatit, petinach, tirik nuakan, kamakalach rihab, kopanku riare, katishishik, kapakalach rikakulha, riuruk rikakik, kutowik riukab riche. So now look at the Spanish version. Ya viene, abuela, ya viene detrás de mí los goterones. She's come, abuela, she's come behind me. Goterones are great big raindrops, giant raindrops. Y llegaba ella, torrencial. She's come, torrential, with thunder and tempests, the wind in her skirts, shaking the branches of the trees. So a pretty vivid description of the coming of the rainstorm, but it's a description that uses these nouns, goterones, big raindrops, torrents, thunder, tempests, winds. Quiche version, however, kamakalach, rihab. This is an idiophone. Kamakalach is a grating sound. So this is the sound that you would get from grating corn against a piece of metal or a piece of wood. This is the grating sound of the rain beginning to fall. So direct representation of the falling of the rain. Kopanku riare katishishik. Kutishishik is the splashing sound, and the repetition of the sh sound also indicating this is a continual process, so not just one sound, but the sound of this torrential rain taking place. Kapakalach rikakulha. Kapakalach is the cracking sound, the cracking of the thunder, rendered here especially well in Quiche, using this sonic quality. These glottal k's and k's are very prevalent in the language, and so this is a way of expressing the fierceness of the storm. And then finally, this one is a little bit difficult to translate into English, but riuruk rikakik. Uruk, as Pablo describes it to me, is the shuffling of a skirt, a woman's skirt. And that is the whooshing of the petticoats, which is the whooshing of the wind, right? And right, all of this is indicating and I think drawing directly the perceptions for the reader in Quiche of this experience of the coming of the rain. Also notice the difference here. The Spanish version has very little of this onomatopoeic quality, little of this idiophonic quality, and so from a translator's point of view, right, the ability to render these expressions is, I would argue, extremely important. Let's note one other specific aspect of Quiche, and especially in distinction to European languages. So we think of European poetry, the rhymes come at the end, right? Roses are red, violets are blue, right? This is typically what we would expect. But you probably noticed right away, there's none of that going on here. However, the stanza above now, Hachi hunmur, chawila we petinakri awanam, kin salik chi hunmur chori huyu, kin kubik richo ulew, kin weyech hunretal, kilatach hun chakachu mir. So notice the repetition, the consistency, the continuity between the lines is actually given by this ka sound. This ka sound is the present continual tense in Quiche. And so each of these lines begins with this statement by the observer that this is going on. And notice also, right, the line, kin salik chi hunmur chori huyub. The phrasing would be exactly the length of a phrase that someone could say in a single breath. So there's no need for punctuation. The line itself, the line break itself, or even better, the reader or the orator of the poem would render this rhythm. Notice now the difference with the Spanish language. Ando otra vez y ve si viene tu hermana y volvía a la misma loma y me quedaba sentado y de repente allá por el norte se distinguía una estrella negra, right? So this continuity is rendered now much more abstractly in Spanish, the conjunction y, and then, and then, and then. So removes some of the oral quality of the language and renders some of the rhythm, but loses, I would argue, some of the oral quality of the language itself that for Ak'abal is, I think, absolutely essential for this particular form of expression. There he is, okay. Okay, so we got the sense of the sound of the language. So now I want to look at another poem. This one is titled Kakamri Katit, La Luna se muere, or Our Grandma is Dying. So it begins Hitsamre subunel, Riishokib kikirikak kichi, Kakamle katit, Akalab, alabom, Chiskasta hok, Chishelo lok, Le katit kakamik, Kikle wachibal, upalach. So this is a poem describing, well, what we would describe, so as descendants of a Western society, scientific understanding of the natural world, we would understand this as a lunar eclipse, right? The moon, the Earth passes between the sun and the moon takes on a reddish color and then, right, begins to disappear altogether. And however, from a indigenous Quiche perspective, something very different is going on. So notice right here, just in the title, Kakamri Katit. Kakamri Katit translates directly as our grandmother is dying. So again, like in the first poem, there is a kind of familial affinity with the natural world. The moon is considered a kind of grandmother figure, but also a goddess. And so the death of this goddess is seen as a kind of foreboding, an omen of danger here on Earth, right? The red color that the moon is taking on is an indication that, well, sickness is invading the community, death is imminent. And so in response, these women are going to go out, and so they're going to shout to the community, wake up, we have to go out, and we have to help cure the moon, right? So their piercing voices climb up from below. They begin rhythmically playing musical instruments as a way of warding off this sickness and warding off this danger. So notice what happens here, right? So just in the title alone, moving from the Quiche version to the Spanish version, instead of our grandmother is dying, la luna se muere. The moon is dying. The moon has now been stripped of this anthropomorphic quality, can still die, but it's no longer anybody's grandmother. It's lost its spiritual significance. And then notice also in the first line. So in Spanish, ahogados de espanto, las mujeres corren la voz. Drowning in fear, the women begin to cry out. So this is a kind of bodily understanding of the fear. This is an internal process that is happening. The women are feeling a kind of drowning sensation because they're so afraid of what's happening. In Quiche, however, hitsamri subunel. So very clearly in Quiche, the agent doing the drowning is actually spirits. Spirits are coming in and choking these women and causing them this sensation of fear. And so when they start shouting, kakam lekatit, they're in some ways responding to the moon, but also to the changes that they're experiencing here on Earth. Now notice, right, so kakam lekatit is the cry of these women. The Spanish version, Ak'abal hasn't translated the language, so he's rendering what these cries would sound like. But notice, even though he hasn't translated from Quiche, he's changed two things. The le of the Spanish article, or of the Quiche article, into the la of a Spanish article, but also ik, the moon. Ik is the Quiche word for moon. And so even though he hasn't translated the language, he's translated the concepts so that a hypothetical Spanish reader, if they could read Quiche, would be able to understand these concepts, which would otherwise be alien to them. And so here, I think very clearly, Ak'abal is understanding, not only is he engaging in a process of translating the literal language, but he's also engaging in perhaps a more difficult process of trying to translate the traditional cultural experiences into languages into a language and into a conceptual understanding that non-indigenous people would understand. And so, right, the poem is going to continue, and thanks to this intervention, eventually it will succeed, and the sickness will pass, or the eclipse will pass, depending on how you understand it, and the world will slowly begin to go back to normal. So we'll return in just a moment to the very end of the poem for another example of distinctive characteristics of Maya poetry in general. First, I want to return and talk a little bit about another characteristic of Maya language and Maya poetry in general, coming again from the Popol Vuh. So, right, again, remember we talked about how in European languages we typically think of the rhymes as just coming at the end of the phrase, but in Quiche this is not how it works. The beginning is much more likely to have this rhyming and continual characteristic. But also in Quiche and the Popol Vuh in particular, another phenomenon known as semantic rhyme is very common. And this is a phenomenon in which there is not just a kind of sonic rhyme, but also a semantic or a rhyme in meaning. The words are paired together in such a way that they're both complementary, causing a kind of continuity, but also increasing the meaning, giving even deeper meaning to whatever it is we're reading. So let's look at some examples here from the Popol Vuh. Iyom mamom, spiokak, shmukane ubi, matzanel, chukunel, kamul iyom, kamul mamom. The midwife, the matchmaker, spiokak and shmukane, their names. Defender, protector, twice a midwife, twice a matchmaker. So these are descriptions of these demigods or gods that are helping make possible this creation process, giving birth to the world. Also, very importantly, the gender identity is not exactly fixed here, and the gods can take on both feminine and masculine qualities. Next line now. Il bal re Popol Vuh, il bal sak petinak chakapalo, utzihoshik kamuhibal, il bal sak kaslim, chuchashik. A place to see it, a council book. The council book, this is the literal translation of the title, the Popol Vuh. This is what it means. It's the council book around which these learned men would sit to seek to understand better the natural world. A place to see the light that came beside the sea, the account of our place in the shadows, a place to see the dawn of life. And so, very importantly, at the beginning of the Popol Vuh, as they're describing the creation of this creation story, the writing of this book is also a repetition or even a continuation of this creation process. And so they're actually going to describe the process. And remember, this is a process in which they are literally risking their lives against the Spanish colonial authorities. They're describing the creation of this book as a replication of the creation of the universe. And so finally, ukach tsukushik, ukach shukutashik, retashik, ukach cheshik. It's 4 cornerings, 4 sidings, 4 measurings, 4 stakings. So this is a description of the gods measuring out the universe so that they can continue this process of creation. Also, it can be taken as a description of the process by which, remember, maize is the sacred food, the sacred sustenance of the Quiche people. This is the process whereby you would measure out a plot of land on which you would grow the sustenance for your family. Also, the process by which you would measure out a home in which your family would reside. And finally, they're also, I think, describing the book itself, this process of measuring and taking order and recreating. Remember, the goal of the gods was to have creatures who were sophisticated enough to be able to truly appreciate this creation process, even by engaging in their own process of creation. So, semantic rhyme, extremely important, and I think we've already seen quite a few examples here in Ak'abal's poetry itself, but one more example here at the end of this poem after the passing of the sickness of the moon. So the Quiche reads, Rikakik shumes richach, rishibanekil richach shibinem. Spanish version reads, seeming you can probably tell already, much more simply, el viento barre cenizas de susto. The wind sweeps away ashes of fear. Quiche version is much more complex, though. The wind, shumes, sweeps away ri chach. Chach are ashes, ri shibinakil, ri chach, ri shibinim. So we have resonance between the word chach and chach. This is the ash and the torch that produces the ash, and also between both shibinakil, which is the agent of fear, and shibinim, that is the act of being afraid. And so, right, Ak'abal here is using the linguistic richness of Quiche to further, I think, describe this scene of, right, both the origins and the resolution of this conflict here. So again, translating solely from the Spanish version, quite a bit gets lost, not only in the essential meaning of this traditional cultural practice, but also of the resonances of the Quiche language itself and what that would mean for Ak'abal. So now another poem. Rikayes. Spishikche in akmach. Rumal shok chuhut chupam. Puneta shinel chuch che ubeshik. Che rehampa shinriko torakan riche. Kochihul che rihun kayes. Shane rumal kopa dukab. Mankinrik tachit haskinbich. Rumal rishin banik. So the story here, they say it was me. I was to blame for the worms getting in. However madly I insist, when I found it at the foot of the tree, the fallen fruit was already pitted. Since I held it in my hand, what else could I say? I was done for. So it doesn't take a scholar to know that this sounds a lot like Christian description of original sin, right? We all know probably the story of the Garden of Eden, the fruit that gets picked from the tree, which becomes the beginning of the sinfulness of humanity. In Quiche, however, right, the term kayes is actually broader than fruit. It means both fruit, but also it can refer to pasturage. It can refer to rotten fruit, food that would essentially be only fit for animals. And so here's another place where knowledge of Ak'abal's life and experience can help us understand his poetry. So there's a story in this testimonial describing a young man who's been working in the fields, walking home with his machete, hasn't had enough to eat, finds a piece of rotten fruit sitting under a tree. He picks up the fruit and begins to try to eat it and is shot by the local overseer, the non-Maya overseer. In response, he's going to attack the overseer with his machete and murder him. And goes about his business, right? So question of his guilt or innocence, according, of course, to the Spanish authorities, he's going to be guilty of this crime. But according to Ak'abal, the suggestion is that simply by being Maya, he's already been considered guilty. And the simple act of subsistence is being met with violence and repression by not only the Spanish conquistadors, but continuing violence under this genocidal regime and the civil war which he's lived through. So, you've been listening to all this description of the kind of distinctions between these languages. One question that might arise. So maybe this is all just incidental, right? Maybe this is just a product of writing in different languages, and inevitably there are going to be different resonances and meanings that are going to come out of this process. So this poem, I think, suggests that, well, Ak'abal is actually doing something deliberate here and is using these differences in languages to think about, on a deeper level, the question of authorship and the possibility of translation itself. So this poem, the Quiche title, Sakiri Sanik, or Amenazamiento. So the word I chose in English is clearing. And this, both the Quiche and Spanish words refer to dawn or dawning. But the Quiche word also, the root is sak, which can mean whiteness or brightness or clarity or enlightenment. And so also clearing, as we'll see, I think is the only adequate word in English to give these kind of dimensions of the dawn that Ak'abal is going to put on display for us here. So he writes, Arehun retal puwiri huyu, arechi kakihri chakab, aresakiri sanim. So he's describing the dawn. And so each of these stanzas is going to describe a stage of the process of the dawn after the sign of the dawn has appeared on the horizon. So after the dawn comes, Sakiribal, this is the clarifier, the agent of the dawning. Are Sakiri Sanik, this is the clearing of the sky once the dawn is fully taking hold. Are Sakirik, now it has completely cleared. And then Are Sakich, the clarity of the dawn, the clarity of the day has now arisen. Sakich is also the word for good morning in Quiche. So now notice the Spanish version, right? So, la línea blanca en el horizonte, al final de la noche, Ak'abal, amanecer. Ak'abal is going to give us here a Quiche lesson. Each one is going to give us the Quiche word, and its translation into Spanish, Sakiribal, clareador, Sakirisanik, clareando, Sakirik, clareado, Sakich, claridad. Notice, however, the very first one, he's changed the word. It's not Arisaki Sinim, it's Ak'abal. This is the name of a day of the Maya calendar. Also, it's another word for dawn. Also, it's the name of the author himself. So he has, I would argue, figuratively signed the Spanish version of the poem here with a recognition of the difference, a recognition of his own name, which also in his interviews and in his memoirs, he argues that even the fact that he has a last name is an imposition of the Spanish conquest. Surnames were imposed on the indigenous population, and he actually has this, I think he would argue to indigenous ears, this name which includes Humerto and Ak'abal, these European and indigenous roots. And so here I think he's drawing our attention, but again, attention that only if you are aware of these linguistic differences, attention to the distinctions between these languages. Last poem, running out of time. Esal camina aquí, los desenterrados, the grave robbers. Wakamik kaberbit ritnukush kasmal, shetalik rich hatach shibinel, shetalik rinimare kik, shetalik riokech hunmulchik rekeshkol, hunmulchik riteo tzenik, riki hahatem riachkamin sanelab, hunmulchik rikach, hunmulchik rishibenakil. Today, my gut trembled, old ghosts returned, the rivers turned back to blood, the weeping returned. Again the pain, again the laughter, the murderer's cackling, the tongue of flame, the terror. So he's describing an encounter with a body that's been pulled out of the ground. The rag's still on it. The skull is open-mouthed. So if you know anything about the aftermath of this civil war that I just talked about, right, many of the bodies that had been of the people killed, tens of thousands of indigenous in particular, were thrown in mass graves, and unmarked graves, no recognition of who they were or their provenance. And so part of the process of reconciliation in the aftermath of this civil war has been an attempt, first and foremost, simply to locate and identify these bodies. And so I think what Ak'abal is describing here is an encounter exactly with one of these corpses which has been taken out of the ground. But again, there's a distinction between the Quiche and the Spanish versions. Los desenterrados in Spanish, this is the bodies themselves that have been disinterred. In Quiche, esal caminacab, this is the person doing the taking, or a grave robber. And so Ak'abal here, I think, is describing the fear being generated by this process of reconciliation, this process of identification, recognizing that digging up the past in this way, even though, right, his entire poetic practice, his entire goal as I think an author writing in this vein is to think about the past in this rich way. Nonetheless, right, the danger that can accompany this process of digging up the ghosts of the past is something that's very much still alive and that he's rendering here for us in this language. Kescho nukush kinokik, mankinwar tak kincho makri kich, arihanepa kono helta kut, kakabishoch ri ubix ri ulew, riman kerta chi kik cheriyuk. I weep for my heart's pain. I can't sleep thinking of the day when everyone can really sing the song of the earth. without blood running from the scars. Sorry. Recall that, right, the event that sets off this whole process of civil war and genocide is the attempt at a restitution of land in the early 1950s, right at the moment that Ak'abal is born, and this attempt at the reconciliation, the attempt at, right, singing the song of the earth, as he describes it here, is, well, both, I think, still absolutely necessary and essential for a kind of historical reconciliation, but also still one that is very much fraught with danger, very much fraught with violence that he is reminding us of. So, well, these are some quotes here. I'll spare you the academic language here, but takeaways here now in my reading of Ak'abal as engaging in this process of putting in practice a pretty sophisticated theory of language is that, right, a lot of critics have argued that the strategic essentialism is solely backward-looking and therefore kind of dangerous, right? Implying perhaps that, well, maybe indigenous people only belong in the past. Maybe they have nothing to do with the modern world. Therefore, right, maybe the strategic essentialism is denying basic rights to these people. But I argue that using the sophisticated theory of language and by his own aesthetic practice, bridging these languages and showing his ability to bridge these worlds and show both their compatibilities and communicabilities, but also their distinctiveness. I think this is the real project and the real value of his work here. And it's ultimately, I think, an expression of his own sense of himself as being indigenous, but also living in a world in which it's impossible to fully embrace that identity, and he's been forced essentially to learn how to navigate an entirely different world while also trying to preserve his own vision and that of his family and his forebears. Well, we're more or less out of time, so I was going to talk some more about some other translation projects, but I think that's enough for now. Maybe I'll spare you, and maybe we can talk sometime in the future. So, Mantios, thank you all for listening. Thanks, of course, to Pablo Francisco Hernandez, my teacher and collaborator in creating these translations. Mayuli Bieri, the wife of Humerto Ak'abal, gave me permission to use these poems. Jess Gagliardi has set this up. Phil Bodie was kind enough to talk about some of these ideas with me, and thanks y'all for coming. We might have time for a question or two if anybody wants to give it a go. Yes. Yes.
Are those expressions that he's been putting into Spanish, or are those expressions have become words in and of themselves?
No, so he argues basically that these words are untranslatable in Spanish. So he doesn't think that Spanish actually has the capacity to express the things that Quiche does, right? And so he can use these abstractions like big raindrops, but you can't render the actual sensory experience in Quiche or in Spanish the way you could in Quiche. And I've attempted to render them in English here, but of course, right, that too is limiting in a lot of ways and is more intended as a kind of gesture towards the original. Another of the problems with the editions of his poems is that not only are the translators translating almost exclusively from the Spanish, also most editions don't even include the Quiche versions. And so readers who might have an interest even in the sounds, rhythms, or appearance of the Quiche language are deprived of it unless they are willing to do some digging. Good question. Other questions?
I'm really impressed with your ability to pronounce Quiche. I hear what I think is Quiche sometimes the local Guatemalan community speaking it, and I just think it's beautiful and amazing, so thank you.
They actually most likely speak Canjobal. Canjobal is a language that is closely related, or somewhat related to Quiche, but it's more related to Mam, which is another of the indigenous languages. They broke off about 600 years ago, or no, longer than that, and so there's been quite a bit of change in distinctiveness. Some of these Quiche dialects are somewhat mutually comprehensible. Caquichel and Quiche, for instance, are very similar. Canjobal would be significantly different, although I am hoping to try to learn it from someone if they're willing to teach me. Other questions? Beautiful. Thanks, y'all. Pleasure having you. Thanks for listening. My email address was up here. If anyone would like to read the essay that this is based on, feel free to send me an email and I'm glad to share it. Hopefully it'll come out in Journal of Translation Review sometime in the indefinite future. That's how academic publishing works. Beautiful. Thanks, y'all. Thank you.